Okay, we're back and we're going to be talking about practical approaches to selection. So we want to know not only whether our battery of tests is valid and is predictive, we also want to know really who's likely to be a successful performance and is the battery cost effective, right? Like these are really practical questions, like who among these applicants is likely to be successful? And then is the battery cost effective? There are two major approaches to selection, the multiple cutoff or the multiple hurdles approach, and then the multiple regression approach. So let's start off by talking about the multiple cutoff approach. It's a really common approach for employers to think about, we have certain criteria that we want met in our applicants. We want these minimum skill sets. And there are different ways that we can sort of establish those cutoffs and use them in selection. So let's start off just talking about what is called the multiple cutoff approach. And it is what we call a non-compensatory method of employee selection. So what that means is that if you have an employee who does really well, really far exceeds the cutoff for one category, and then they are below the cutoff for another category, you can't say, well, those two average out, so they basically pass those two cutoffs. If you don't pass one of the cutoffs, you literally are not eligible for employment. So the non-compensatory method is where non-compensatory method means literally that you cannot use one category to compensate for the other. Passing scores or cutoffs are set on each predictor, and the employees must pass all of those predictors. And usually they're applied all at one time. So I thought I'd give you an example. Let's say we're hiring a new professor, and we have these criteria that they need to have at least a PhD. They have to score above a 30 on the interview. They have to score above a 30 on their job talk rating or their work sample rating. And they have to have had at least 10 publications. You'll notice I have plus signs in between each of these. I don't mean add them together. I mean you have to have at least a PhD and a interview score that's above 30 and a job talk rating that's above 30, and you have to have at least 10 publications. So all of those must be met. If you have, let's say, a PhD and you've got, let's say, 30 publications, and then your interview score is a 25 and your job talk rating is a 25, you're not qualified. Even though you're well above the number of publications, that can't compensate for being below on interview or job talk, or flip that over, right? Like you're a great interview and you gave a great job talk, but you only have 8 publications. You don't qualify. You have to have all of these in place. And so that's what we mean by non-compensatory. It's not like being really above average or really above the target in one category can compensate for the other. And all of these have to happen at the same time. So usually with the multiple cutoff method, all of these are equally weighted. We go through the process of all of this with each candidate. So, each candidate has the chance to be interviewed and to give the job talk, right? Everybody has that opportunity, and they all get the score and they get cut off if any of those scores are below the level. The multiple hurdle is very similar. It's under the category of multiple cutoff, but the difference is we're going to administer the predictors in a predetermined order, and usually that order is going to be determined by cost. So usually you're going to have a cutoff that is free usually as your first cutoff, and then you start moving. If the person passes that cutoff, then they get to go to the next one, then they get to go to the next one, and so on. And usually the most expensive ones are saved for only the people who have passed those previous hurdles. So you get to move to that next hurdle after exceeding the cutoff for the previous predictor. So let's stay on our idea of hiring a professor, and I reorganized this flowchart a little bit because now it's a multiple hurdle. So the person has to have at least a PhD. So if they report that they have some other kind of degree, they haven't cleared that hurdle, and so they don't get to go to the next issue, which is where the number of publications would be assessed. And if they have at least 10 publications, then they get to move to the next hurdle. If not, then they aren't part of the candidate pool anymore. Then we go to the next level, and I added in here, maybe there's going to be a phone or a Zoom interview that's going to happen as the next level. Now, this is a little bit more costly than assessing whether the person has a PhD or the number of publications, because that would be free, right? Like basically, I mean, I guess there's some cost to the hiring committee having to put their eyes on the person's curriculum vitae and determining their degree and how many publications they have. So I guess there's a little bit of cost as far as time, but very minimal, right? Whereas a phone or a Zoom interview is going to involve coordinating the committee to all be together and spend some of their valuable time to sit in this interview that's probably going to last half an hour at least on the phone, asking structured questions, right? And so you can see sort of moving through the level of investment that's going into each of these hurdles. So we're not going to waste a phone Zoom interview on everybody who applies. Only those people who have met those first criteria get a phone interview. And let's say that they need to have a score of at least 10 on that phone interview. So the committee has to agree that they scored high enough on the phone interview before then they would be invited to campus for an in-person interview. And they need to have at least a score of 30 on that in-person interview before we have, a group of people all gather together to watch their job talk or their work sample, whatever you want to call it. So you can see like the more time is invested, or by the time we're doing an in-person interview, there might be travel costs that the employer is going to incur to bring that person in for an interview, those kinds of things. And then with the job talk, of course, we have to recruit people to be the audience for that job talk. And so now we have that kind of investment. And so you can see how maybe you would want to save the in-person interview for just the people who have already cleared those previous hurdles. So you're not investing that kind of energy and money into people who really aren't qualified, and we should have figured that out before they came. So the multiple cutoff, all those decisions are made, like everybody experiences all of those criteria. The multiple hurdle, you only experience the next hurdle if you've passed the previous one. So you can kind of imagine that the multiple hurdle is a really common strategy when there is time and investment that's going to happen with the different levels. I mean, can you imagine if you invited every single person who applied to Microsoft to come to one of those assessment centers, and they all spent 2 to 3 days in the assessment center? Probably we're going to have some kind of multiple hurdle where only certain candidates get to experience the assessment center, because it's so it's such a big time investment, and it's so expensive to put it on. Like actually physical money will be invested into it. So you can kind of imagine that the multiple hurdle makes a lot of sense if you're going to have those really more detailed kinds of hiring practices. On the other hand, you could see where multiple cutoff would make a lot of sense if you're going to have things like, a job application and then an interview. You might say, I'll just interview everybody who applies. Maybe if there aren't very many applicants, you might go through the whole multiple cutoff because you haven't had many applicants. So we have to see everybody who did apply and see which one, if any, qualify, right? So you can kind of see an argument for both, depending on the circumstances and the situation. All right. Another way that we could assess our candidates is to use a multiple regression approach. It's a statistical approach, and I just thought I'd share with you the statistical annotation of a multiple regression. So what we're going to be assessing with a multiple regression is how well a set of predictors, and I've circled all the predictors, which are the X's in this annotation. So the X's are going to be the predictors. So how well a series of predictors forecasts a performance criterion, which is the Y in this. So Y is what we want to know, and X is all of the predictors that we're using to try and estimate Y. And you can see there's plus signs between them. So we have all these different X's that we're going to try and combine in a way to actually assess, to predict Y. The B is the intercept with the y-axis, and if you were to graph this out, and it tells us at what point along the y-axis the line is going to intersect with the y-axis, and then the slope is the other B's that are paired, that are going to be multiplied by the x's, and that's going to tell us whether the slope of the line is flat, which means there is no prediction, or if it's tilted up to the right or down to the right. That tells us whether they're positively or negatively associated with each other. So it's going to tell us the slope, basically. All right, so the steps involved. So first off, we're going to have some kind of prediction scheme that we're going to use with the applicant data. So we're going to need to apply that scheme. Scheme sounds wrong. Strategy. So we're going to try and figure out a way to apply a strategy to use the applicant data to make our prediction. And then we're going to rank order our applicants based on their predicted criterion scores, which is the predicted performance on the job. So first we have to develop a scheme, and then we have to figure out a way to rank order our applicants based on that data. So I thought I had one more slide, sorry. So in a multiple regression, we're going to determine which of our predictors gets fed into the multiple regression analysis first. And that's a little tricky. If we think that the most important predictor of success as a professor is the job talk, we're going to put that predictor into the multiple regression analysis first and let it reveal how much of the variance is being accounted for by the job talk. If we think the next most important thing for a professor to do is to publish, we might feed in their publication number as our next predictor of success, and so on. So you can use a prediction, sort of a strategy for deciding which of the data that we've collected we think is primary in predicting success, secondary. We could have lots of different measures, so we could be at 5th or 6th place ability to predict. We can place that information into the regression analysis. Once we've done that, then we rank order our applicants based on the predicted criterion score. So we'd say, well, this person's predicted to be the most successful in this job, so they would get number 1 ranking among the applicants. This person, the prediction is that they would not do very well in the job, so they're going to be at the bottom of our rank ordering. And so you place the applicants in rank order based on what this statistical approach tells us would be their likelihood of success on the job. One of the nice things about using a statistical analysis is that you take out sort of that bias that is inherent in human decision making, where we might accidentally include in our minds irrelevant information about the candidate. I'm reading this book about Tversky and Kahneman, which is a pair of psychologists who won a Nobel Prize in economics for their research. And so far, I'm only into chapter 2. But so far, all we've been talking about in the book is about this guy who, if I was a better reader, I could tell you his name, but he works for the Mavericks NBA team, and he's trying to predict which up-and-coming basketball player would do well on the team. And he uses a multiple regression approach to try and, feed in details about their college play and other factors to try and predict who will do well. And one of the things he reported is that when he got to see a player who turned out to be a superstar player who was of Chinese descent, he didn't think that player was going to do very well, and they actually ended up passing on him. And he said, looking back, he has to acknowledge that there was nothing in that player's resume that should have led him to pass on him, except for his own bias, where he's like, well, Asians aren't very good at basketball. And he's like, I didn't even know I was doing that, but I actually overrode my own multiple regression analysis with my personal bias. And, we don't want to use biases when we're making hiring decisions like that. And he, of course, made a really bad decision because that player turned out to be an outstanding player. We want to use as much objective evidence as we possibly can. And so multiple regression analysis gives us sort of these objective numbers to rely on, so we don't just override things with our maybe implicit biases or other factors. So if we let the multiple regression do its job, that little statistical analysis, then we can rank order our applicants and make our decisions based on, hard numbers. So, benefit. One of the things that's really nice about a multiple regression approach is that we can go back and analyze the success of the prediction. And that's what this guy is stuck in a loop of trying to figure out how to predict who's going to be a good NBA player. There's so many variables in employees, right? Things that can turn out to have been important now that you see how it all worked out. And so you can really maximize the predictive ability of the battery that you're using if you let multiple regression reveal to you which ones are working really well and which ones aren't. You can take some out, you can add some in, you can kind of be changing your battery all the time. Things to consider about this method: we might want to use a cutoff approach in order to on the end of the predicted criterion to exclude those who are below the standard of acceptable performance. We might want to have a cutoff so that we can really find out which parts of the battery are predicting success, right? We really want to focus on what predicts success on the job. So we might want to have a cutoff. And then we might want to still have cutoffs on each predictor as well. We might want to say we only want to analyze those people who were above the cutoffs or something like that, so that we can make sure that we're really considering the people who seem to have the qualities that we're really looking for. All right, I'm going to stop here. This is a little briefer than my previous lecture, but this is a good place to stop because I'm going to go through all of these aspects of the selection process in the next video.